But it's great to be here with you this evening and just share some time with you and share some thoughts with you. And what a great church. It's brilliant to see churches sending teams away overseas to the Philippines like that. 18 people. I don't know how many people you fit in here normally, but I kind of figure 18 out of your congregation's a few people. Good on you for doing that. It's great to see churches that care, and to hear about the interest in poverty is good. And I want to talk about care being an action. Something that we actually do rather than something that we think. And I'll get onto that in a little bit. First off, I wanted to tell you a story. There was this guy who was a boss of one of the big companies, and he had an urgent problem, and I'm a boss of a big company. When you've got a problem, what you do is you call someone to help you with the problem. And he wanted to deal with something quite late at night. So he called one of his team and said, look, I'm going to need some help, was in his head. Calls up, and the phone is answered by this kind of very young voice, and he hears a hello. He didn't really expect to hear a little kid's voice down the end of the phone, but that's exactly what he heard. And the boss sort of said, is your daddy home? And the voice whispered, no. And he said, well, is your mummy home? And the voice whispered, yes. Well, can I talk to her? And the voice whispered, no. Well, wondering where Daddy was and why Mummy couldn't talk, he said, well, is there anybody else there? And he said, well, yes, there's a policeman. And the fireman's outside with Daddy. He said, well, can I speak to one of them, please? And the little voice whispered, no. Starting to get a little bit disconcerted about what was going on, the boss wondered, well, Dad's outside of the farm and there's a policeman and Mum inside, this sounds worrying. And then he sort of heard a whirring across the phone, and he said, what is that noise? And the little voice said, it's a jellycopter. Well, starting to get really concerned, he said, what's actually going on there? And the little voice said, they're all searching for me. Now, when it comes to poverty in Australia, poverty is something that we care about, we want to think about, and we want to act on. In fact, there's a lot of energy put into resolving it. There's lots of resources thrown at poverty, but actually poverty in many ways is still a hidden voice in our country whispering that I'm still here. And I think for many of us it's hard to kind of get a context of poverty, and we need to learn to understand a little bit more about it. Back in the 1980s, before some of you were born, one of our great Prime Ministers then, a guy called Bob Hawke, in 1984 said that by 1990, no child in Australia will live in poverty. Well, what a great aspiration to have, that should be the case in our country. And sadly, today as then, often people laugh at the naivety of that statement, that the Prime Minister could realistically have thought in our country that we could end poverty. But there is no doubt in Bob Hawke's heart, he actually had the right thought going on. Poverty is an issue in our nation. And every fair-thinking Australian would surely think that poverty shouldn't happen in our country. You know, we're kind of pretty rich in Australia, and we do okay, and I think most of you would agree. Now, we wouldn't expect poverty to be part of our lives, but it is. And one of the things I wanted to start to do is to sort of share about what is the size of the problem that Bob Hawke was talking about. How does it kind of play out? And then what are we supposed to do about it? Well, if you don't think you're involved in poverty, if you're paying a tax bill, I just want to let you know that probably a third of your tax bill is going towards dealing with the issue of poverty in Australia. So if you care about nothing else, then care about the cheque that goes out and the money that goes out every week to deal with poverty. And statistically, when you look at the issue of poverty, it falls into 4 areas in Australia. So I can make it very simple for you. The first group of people who fall into poverty, that's caused by what I call economic issues. They just don't have enough money to live on. The second group of people living in poverty, they're in poverty because of their health. The third big issue of poverty in Australia I call an issue of remoteness or Indigenous affairs. And lastly, I guess there's an area I'll call imported poverty, which is asylum seekers who have come to our country or people who have migrated here who are living in poverty. And I understand you had some discussion on asylum seekers last year. Those 4 groups predominantly form the issue of poverty in Australia today. And by an international measure, they kind of measure how much income people have, and then they measure an average income, and they measure what would be poverty in a nation. In Australia, 2.3 million people live below the line that they would say, if you're below that amount of income, you're living in poverty. So that's nearly 10 to 12% of our population are classified as living in poverty. Now, of those, 640,000 of this group that I said, is about their health. So they're sick, something's stopping them working, they can't participate. So that group we understand pretty well. The remote areas of Australia and Indigenous remote disadvantage, that's about 100,000 people. And the balance essentially are people who are living in economically caused poverty. Within those numbers, 700,000 children growing up in what's technically referred to as poverty. To take this a little bit further, one of the things which is interesting and why people don't kind of see that much poverty around them is in Australia, poverty is by and large located in 14 postcodes. So 80% of those people live in 14 postcodes or they live in the outback. Now, I don't know about you. Actually, I would say I can't say this. I do go to the outback, but I don't know how often you guys have been to the outback, but probably not that often. And I wonder how often you've been to some of the communities that are disadvantaged, with high levels of disadvantage. And I can talk around the country, but in Sydney, Mount Druitt is known as a place which is a bit of a worry. Macquarie Fields, Blacktown. I go to other parts of the country. Elizabeth in South Australia is an area which has immense poverty. Ipswich in Queensland, where there was rioting late last year, area of immense poverty. So 14 areas where most of the poverty is located in Australia, which creates a bit of a challenge for us because if we want to respond, yes, there's local response in our own communities, and I'll get onto that in a bit, but there's also the issue of how do we help challenge communities which we may not have a relationship with, change what's going on for them. Put very, very simply, if you are chronically ill or you don't have a job in Australia, you're pretty much going to live in poverty. And to give some context to that, only 4% of people who are earning an income live under that poverty line. And those 4% tend to fall in and out of that group. Most of them are doing casual jobs that were in manufacturing. Their current income sources changed a bit, but they live in a situation where they fall in and out of poverty. So pretty much we can say that if you don't have work, you're going to have some problems in life. And one of the things that we focus on, particularly at Mission Australia and have done since 1974, is the need for economic participation and for work for people. Because it's pretty clear that if you've got a job and you're not going to live in poverty, that is a route out of poverty. And it's a route to pay for housing. It's a route to pay for economic participation. In simple terms, we basically say that work works for people. It works for them, for their families and their communities. And one of the things we can do is help people through the journey towards work, to help them uncover why they're not in a job and help them get into one. Now, when we strip away all of that, there's around 400,000 to 600,000 people in Australia who essentially rely on the help of non-profit organisations and very heavy investment from government just to live daily lives. Now, you might sort of look at that and think, that's a lot of people. 105,000 homeless on any given night in Australia, 31,000 people in jail, 50,000 children in care every night. Just that group alone, nearly 200,000 people who pretty much on a daily basis are relying on other people to support them in life. So that's a big chunk of people, and then you add their families on and it kind of adds up pretty quickly. Extending out to remote communities probably is something which shows us the most painful poverty. And in simple terms, you've got teams going out to the Philippines. So I can tell you, if you haven't been to the remote outback of Australia, and as we said earlier, I work with World Vision, I've been to overseas countries and seen third world environments. Our remote communities, in some cases, are as bad, and in fact, in some cases, are worse. And frankly, given the choice, I would rather be poor in India than in remote Australia, personally. And that's a radical kind of thing to say, but our remote communities are really quite shocking places, both from the issue of poverty, but probably as importantly, the issue of a lack of hope. And I'll get on to talk about that a little bit more as well. It's not a very pretty picture, and I'm sorry to tell you that for all the closing the gap policies and the third of your tax money that goes into dealing with the issue of poverty in Australia, over the last 13 years, it's got worse. It's not going backwards, it's going forwards. In fact, it's gone up by about 10% the number of people living in poverty. And a bit like that little boy who was hidden away, there's a hell of a lot of resources being thrown at this issue of poverty. And there's a quest to deal with it, but we're just not cutting through. In fact, for most people, they get to be poor by an accident of birth. Being born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and for many at that point, they're doomed to have a pretty poor life. Children who are born into single-parent families are invariably unlikely to economically participate successfully in the future and are likely to be single parents themselves. 75% of children of people who are incarcerated are likely themselves to be incarcerated. Children of people who suffer addictions are themselves likely to suffer from addictions. Essentially, many people are born into this situation. Now, Fiona and I have 5 children, and my experience of parenting has been quite interesting. You kind of wake up one day with this child that eats, sleeps, poos, eats, sleeps, poos, and sleeps if you're lucky. And if your mum and dad kind of trained you pretty well and brought you up well, you might have a vague idea how to be a parent. But if your mum and dad didn't bring you up well, and didn't give you good guidance, and didn't show you how to parent, how are you going to parent your children? How are you going to guide them? How are you going to teach them the right way for the future? Because the aspiration might be that most mums want their kids to have a good life. But if you don't know what a good life is and how to create it, then how are you going to do anything different for your children than what was done for you? If you were never read to, the likelihood is you'll never read to your children. If you were never played with, the likelihood is you won't play with your children. If you went to school and you were told you were done, that you weren't smart and you dropped out in year 9, you don't tend to have that great an impression of school for when your children are going to go there. And so therefore it's easier to say, skipping a day or two here or there, maybe not such a big deal. And in fact, the ingrown way that we're just brought up in some cases means that we're condemned to repeat the past that our parents suffered. For those living in the outback, colonisation and the pain of that continues today. The pain of some of the policies that we've had over the last 70 or 80 years still exists today. I work with a lot of Indigenous staff and a lot of Indigenous people, and the raw pain of a stolen generation, the raw pain of being taken away from your land is still within people. And that exists, and that causes poverty and causes pain today. If you live in this situation, well, your life is going to be shorter than everyone else's. Your education is going to be poorer than everybody else's. You're more likely to suffer a chronic disease such as diabetes, and you're more likely to spend a proportion of your life struggling and find it difficult to get out of the situation you're in. If you're in a remote community, the likelihood is you'll suffer, in some cases, an almost complete lack of hope that there is any opportunity to have a different way of life. Fiona and I were lucky enough to go up to a place called Mornington Island 2 years ago where Mission Australia works. Mornington is stark by two regards. Firstly, in the Western world, it has the Western world's second highest murder rate in a community of 1,300 people, and also has Australia's highest teenage birth rate. The interesting thing I found there, coming particularly from a community development background where you're an expert in how to fix these things, is that they had everything that secular society said they should have. They had a police station, they had an early childhood education, they had hospitals, they had schools, they had social workers. They had absolutely everything that our best science would say they should have. And yet what that community lacked was hope. And the provider of hope in my life and in your lives is Christ. And one of the things we need to do is to start to be, for those who are lost and hurt, purveyors of hope. Now, knowing a little bit about the facts is really good. I want to take you from that to knowing a little bit about, well, what does Jesus think about all this kind of stuff? And there's some things that he can teach us in terms of how he acted, in terms of what he did, that can help guide our behaviour. And I want to read from Luke chapter 16, and I'm going to read from verses 19 through to 26. There was a rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. But at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, whose body was covered with sores, who longed to eat what fell from the rich man's table. In addition, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell he was in torment. He looked up and he saw Abraham far off with Lazarus at his side. So he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water and cool my tongue, because I am in anguish in this fire." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus likewise received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. Besides that, there is a great chasm fixed between you and he, and no one can cross from this side to that side." In this story, I think Christ is relaying a few things to us. First thing, which is really interesting, is he actually doesn't condemn wealth. He doesn't say that wealth of itself is a problem, which hopefully is a comfort for some of you. You might not think you live a sumptuous life, but compared to people around the world, most people in Australia live in the world's top 3% of wealth. Now, if you live in the top 20% of wealth in Australia, you're probably, by global standards, doing okay. You might not call it sumptuous, but you're probably living an alright life. But Jesus doesn't actually condemn that. Second thing, this is the only parable of Christ where he mentions a name. Lazarus is the only name mentioned by Christ in a parable. What Jesus is telling us is that the poor have a name. A homeless person on the street is Lazarus. The prostitutes in our community have a name. Drug addicts have a name. The mentally ill have a name. The kiddie or school that no one plays with who's got no decent clothes and doesn't have decent shoes has a name. And Christ wants us to know the poor have a name. Not only do they have a name, they have a story. And Christ here relays the story of Lazarus. The other thing which is interesting in the story is that there are two chasms. The first chasm is the attitude of the rich man in life to Lazarus, where he makes no effort to cross from his sumptuous wealth to the other side of the chasm to deal with the man named Lazarus. Even though he knows of his existence, he makes no effort to cross from one side to the other. The second chasm is after he's died. And the message there is pretty clear that actually once you're kind of done and married, and hopefully we'll be in heaven, we can't go back and undo what we haven't done. There's no way to cross that chasm. And Jesus is quite clearly saying to us that actually our responsibility in our lifetime is to cross the chasm now between us and our wealth and those who are poor. And that's an individual responsibility that we perhaps have to take on board. Now, I hear different stories around this. Some people will turn around and say, well, I pay a lot of taxes, so surely the government should go and do the job. Other people say, there's lots of charities, there's Anger Care out there, they could go and do the job, surely. Well, the government has been doing the job for 108 years in Australia. And Anger Care probably has been around for that period of time as well. And we still have the poor with us. And I want to posture that actually the change which is needed is a change in our hearts where we personally need to take on board our responsibility to individually deal with poverty. And I'll talk through maybe what that looks like in a minute or two. Second story of Jesus I want to focus on is, further reinforcement of the ability of people, even good people, good Christian type people, to sit back and do nothing. This is from John 5. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there's a pool called Bethzapha. It's covered by 5 walkways. A great number of sick, blind, lame and paralysed people were lying in the walkways. There was a man there who had been disabled for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and realised that he had been disabled for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to become well?" And the sick man answered, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool where the water is stirred up. While I'm trying to get up and go to the water, someone else always gets there before me." And Jesus says to him, "Stand up, pick up your mat and walk." And immediately the man was healed, and he picked up his mat and started to walk. Now, this man's community was not far different from ours. In fact, good Jewish people were living alongside him in this community. This is Jerusalem he's talking about. This is not the outback of Australia. That was a community with people who were implored in the Old Testament to do right by those who were disadvantaged. But for 38 years, no one stood up to help this man into the water. And I think Jesus has shown a fairly powerful message that it is easy for us to forget to go and help people. And then what he does is something quite profound. He actually gives us the tools to change people's situation, which is to go and say to them, do you actually want to be healed? Do you want to have a change in your life? Do you want to move out of being unemployed into work? Do you want to move out of homelessness into a home? Do you want to take the curse of addiction and get rid of it and put it in the past? Do you want your community in the outback of Australia to be different than it is today? If so, stand up. Stand up and do something different. The heart of the message of Mission Australia which is standing together, is to go out as Christians and say to those who are living in disadvantage, however long they've been there, stand up and we'll stand with you, alongside you, to help you through a journey of change. To change poverty takes, generally speaking, in people's lives, some form of catalytic event, which is a one-on-one relationship, not far different from someone coming to Christ. People come out of poverty, generally speaking, as individuals who are reformed and transformed by someone coming alongside of them and saying, will you go on a journey of change? Now, I want to share the story of a young man called Josh with you, who's one of the guys who we work with in Mission Australia. Josh, when he met me, was 17 years old. He was a quite articulate young man, nice guy, fairly well presented, and I met him at one of our homeless services. I sat down and had a chat to him and did what I usually do, is just say, hey, what's your name? And tell me a little bit about you. How did you end up in a homeless service at 17? So Josh said, hey, I'm Josh, and it's a pretty long story how I ended up here. Do you want to hear the story? And I was like, yeah, I've got all the time in the world to hear your story. And actually, if there's one thing you can do for people who are disadvantaged, is sit and listen and give them time and hear their story. His story started at 3, when his mum, who was a single parent involved in the gangs in Western Australia, decided to do what she thought was the right thing. She actually thought she wasn't a good mother, she wasn't going to do the right thing by Josh, so she gave him up to the care of the government in the hope that they would take him and foster him out, and he would have a better opportunity in life than she could ever give him. Well, that didn't quite work out for Josh, and by the time I met him at 17, he had lived in 42 homes between the age of 3 and 17. And in those homes he'd suffered mental, physical and sexual abuse, to the point when he was 13, he started to run away from those homes. And he started to live on the streets of Perth, and he started to use drink and drugs to escape from the pain that he suffered. And then he told me the story of organisations like ours at Mission Australia who, when he misbehaved, would kick him out. And of the 42 places that he went to, a number of them he was kicked out because he misbehaved. He wasn't that nice a kid to be around. And frankly, if you met Josh when he was not a nice kid, you would have crossed the street. I would have crossed the street, because he would have been after your money, your wallet, or stealing from you. Or if not doing that, probably fighting with you or one of your kids. He just wasn't a pleasant guy to be around then. When he came to our service, Josh found something which was slightly different, because we work on a philosophy, firstly, of non-judgment. But we actually don't care about people's pasts, we care about their futures. So whatever's gone on in the past, we put in the past. Secondly, we accept people and let them journey through their pain. And for Josh, what this meant was, for a couple of weeks at our service, he behaved fairly well. But then he started to be abusive to staff, to other clients, and to kick holes in the wall, and to drink, and to do all the stuff he used to do. In fact, that's what he'd done for the last few years, which he got him kicked out of everywhere else he'd been. But the staff didn't kick him out, they let him do that, and let him get angrier and angrier, until he broke down and started to cry. And at the point he started to cry, the staff asked the question, do you want to stand up and have a different life? Because if you do, let's understand your story and let's work together on a different way forward. And the staff there who are Christians worked with Josh to have a different way forward. And as he described it, for him, it was the first place in his life where he'd felt love. In fact, the night before I met him, the staff member, he got up at 3 in the morning to go and see one of the staff because he wanted a hug. Now, a lot of organisations won't let that kind of thing happen, but it was a female staff member, and she gave him a hug because actually there is no one else in his life who will ever touch him or give him physical love. And she was able to show him the love and care that also happened spiritually and mentally for him. When you know Josh's story, sometimes when you see a kid like him on the streets, particularly in the inner cities, you'll see kids like this. I'm sure there's some around this area. you suddenly start to realise that the story has created the person who's in front of you today. And one of the things we need to do with Mission Australia is understand that stories and past has created the person that's in front of us today. And when you deal with a person who's homeless, when you deal with a person who's got mental health issues, when you deal with a person who's suffering poverty, some allowance for their story and their history needs to be made. Is then an issue, if you know someone's story and someone's name, well, what can you do about it? And actually quite often it's almost too much to do anything. You kind of get overwhelmed with all these problems, everything that's going on, and you kind of say, well, what can I do to make a difference? Well, actually, personally, I wasn't any different from you guys 15 years ago. I was an individual sitting in a church not much bigger than this, and felt a call to go and do something. Not everyone's going to have that, but actually everyone can individually get up and do something. At Mission Australia, we're actually bringing out a program this year which is called Coach, and that's a mentoring program which will train Christians how to build relationships with people who are disadvantaged, not far off in the city centres, but in their community. To come alongside them one-on-one and just have one relationship where they can help a person through a journey of change. And the reason we need training is actually we don't know how to communicate with people who are disadvantaged quite often. In fact, many of us are scared to communicate with people who are disadvantaged. And the fact is, the people who are homeless, people who've been addicted to things, people who've got mental health issues, people who've been prostitutes, they're different from us. And they're different from most people in churches. And we actually need to learn to cross the chasm between us and our comfort and them. And that takes us being prepared to step out. And Coach, which will come out later this year, is a program just to train people how to do that and to get over their fear, to learn people's names, and to learn to relate and to learn how to help. However, if that was too much for you, let me just give you a picture of charity in Australia. We are a very lucky nation. We actually have one charity for every 27 people. So for you guys in the room, there's probably about 2.5 charities in this room. Now I talked about the chasm between the rich man and Lazarus, but he didn't choose to cross the chasm. If you can't find poverty on your doorstep in this community, it's not because it's not there, it's because you're not looking. And if you want to find it, go and talk to the organisations in this community that are doing something. I don't know what you might be doing as a church, but I can guarantee there will be service organisations within a 5k radius of here helping the disadvantaged. Uniting Care, Anchor Care, Mission's probably got some programs out here. Salvation Army will have programs out here. Secular organisations will have programs out here. If you can't do anything else, go talk to them and say, can I help out? Is there something I can do individually, personally, to make a difference? If you're at school, one of the things, I don't want to pick on you guys as youth groups, but I've been to other youth groups where young people, they're kind of fired up, they love Jesus, they're kind of all on fire for him, and they're passionate about who he is, and yet when it comes to school, the disadvantaged kid or the ugly girl that no one wants to talk to, the Christian kids don't talk to either. They don't step beyond their boundary to reach out. And this is not something which is for adults, it's for all of us to say we all can go and make a difference. And at school, go and find the kids that no one includes, the kids that have nothing, and say to them, we will include you, we will love you, we will care for you in our community, in our school. We can all get up and do something. And if you can't find something locally, it's because you're not looking hard enough. So go find it, and if you really can't, email me, I'll find the people who do it around here for you. Just go and say, what can I do to help? If you see people who are homeless, Fiona and I were walking home the other day, there's 2 guys on a bench, 2 big bottles of beer, looking pretty grumpy, I have to say. And we just walked by and said, hi guys, how you going? And they looked up and they both smiled and said, yeah, good thanks, have a great night. And for them, we may have been the only people who gave them time of day, but even that little ounce of joy is building a relationship and crossing a chasm. And I want to encourage you, my experience of people who are disadvantaged is they're actually no different from you or I. They might have a few problems and a bit of pain, but they're just people, and they have relationships like everybody else, pretty easy to communicate with, and if you give them a bit of time a day, you get to see some wonderful things. The most wonderful thing I think you see in disadvantaged people, though, is that's where you find Christ. Because you find that the heart of all people is good, and Christ actually has some form of presence in nearly every community and nearly every person, and there is goodness which is spread by the kingdom of God throughout our land. And often when we're feeling down and we're not kind of feeling that connection with God, going out and working with someone in a disadvantaged community, you suddenly realise this is where God is working. This is where He's got His hands and feet. And the story of Lazarus tells you He cares about the poor. He's interested in the poor, and He has a place in His heart and a place in heaven for the poor. And it's a place where we can engage and meet with Christ as well. As I said earlier, mission exists to meet human need and spread the knowledge of the love of God. And often with the poor, until they've seen the love of Christ displayed through us, because Jesus can't do it personally anymore, He relies on us to do it. The transformation of coming to Him is not going to occur until they've seen His love. But often once confronted by Christ's love, us being His hands and feet, lets us take them on a journey where their lives truly can be transformed to the point where they know Him. Christ is the answer to poverty in Australia, both in communities and in individuals. But He works through us. We need to know the names of those who are disadvantaged. We need to not turn a blind eye. And personally, we need to be proactive and cross the chasm. And we need to be servants of Lazarus. Thanks very much for listening in tonight, and I think we're going to have a few questions now.
Thanks, Toby, for that. Fantastic final statement. Christ is the hope, the answer to poverty. You don't hear that very often. I'm about to come around and you can ask a question. I want to ask one first. Are you hopeful about the church's engagement in the area of poverty? Many people have said that one of the blind spots that continues for the church in the West is its blindness to the needs of poverty. What are you seeing, and where are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful that Christ will find a way to respond. And one of the things which was a catalyst for me to go on this journey of doing something was actually a meeting with a guy called Tony Campolo, who is a great campaigner for God, for Christ, and for the disadvantaged in the world. I asked Tony Campolo a question once on precisely this issue because I was concerned about the lack of action of the church towards poverty. And what Tony said profoundly hit me. He said, if the church does not respond, God will do His work. And he said, if Christians don't stand up, God will find people who will stand up and do His work. And don't think that's not God working, because it is. And you can go into the Old Testament and look at how God moved in some of the kings and some of the rulers who weren't Christians back in those days. And that profoundly affected me. And one of the reasons I got into this work is because actually I want the church to be the response. I want people to respect Christ. I want them to understand that we are people who can serve Him. In my work, one of the questions I often get is, what's it like working with government, being a Christian organisation? They don't want to work with you because they're all kind of secular. Behind the scenes, let me tell you how it is with government. I've been lucky enough to work with the last 4 Prime Ministers and meet them all individually. And what they will say to you behind closed doors is this. We will never publicly go out and say that we want to work with Christian organisations and we want Christian values and a Christian ethos in serving the poor. But we know that Christian organisations do a far better job than we can, and they do a far better job than non-Christian organisations. And the reason why is the heart and values of Christ is the answer to the problem. What I'm seeing is a yearning in individuals in the church to see change, and a question of how can I respond. And at Mission, one of the reasons we're setting up this program called Coach is to actually give people a personal, tangible response. Because I think people want to do stuff. I don't know how you are, but I go to church and I want to do stuff, and I often think, what can I do? I just want to help make a difference. And I think that's the hope of the everyday Christians. I'm not so sure I'm kind of quite getting that from our leaders yet, but I'm hoping and praying that they will be transformed on this journey as well.
Anyone with a question?
When you go out into the community, do you have vacant housing that you give to the people that need, or is there like a waiting list, or how does that work?
Yeah, we actually do have housing at Mission Australia, but we're trying to grow more and more housing because we believe that if we can get people into a house, that's what's going to make a difference to their lives, to their homeless. We only have so many though. And what we try and do is, with our housing, guarantee a certain proportion to Indigenous people and a certain proportion to homeless people. So we keep open some of our houses in situations where there's a crisis, where homeless people can come almost immediately into those. Now, that doesn't mean that every day we're going to have a house for homeless people. We try and keep houses available ready to get homeless people into as soon as possible. We actually have about 2,000 houses across the country, and our goal is to build up to 10,000 houses where we can get people into homes very quickly, very effectively. We actually set up 2 years ago in Kingswood in Western Sydney probably the world's largest response to family homelessness. And in that area, we have 540 houses to help families who are most at risk of homelessness. And we work to keep people in their own houses, but where they've lost them, try and get them back into them. So we try and do that, but the fact is we're kind of like everyone else, we're resource constrained. But, you know, local churches like yours are actually going and renting a house and saying, we can get together, we'll rent the house, and backing putting people into the house until they can afford to pay the rent themselves. It's not actually too hard to do some of that sort of stuff. In fact, there's a guy from a church like this in Melbourne who's looking after 17 homes. He's one person who's got a job. He's rented 17 homes and got homeless people into homes in his local community. So there are things like that we can all do.
Thanks very much for your talk, which was really informative and challenging. I was reading last year about an organisation in the UK called Green Pastures, where a minister, Pete Cunningham's his name, gave up his pension and basically gave his unit up to a homeless couple. And that spurred on, and a whole heap of other people did the same sort of thing. And it turned out that in this community in Birmingham, there's no rough sleepers on the street anymore. It strikes me that one of the biggest problems that we probably have in Australia is that because the government is supporting as best they can this issue, I think sometimes as Christians we sit on our hands and think that the job's being done. I'm just interested to know what you think about those sort of programs and whether the fact that a lot of government money is going towards the homeless might be stopping Christians from doing what they ought to be doing.
Yeah, look, I think Australia is a very unique nation, and our answer to everything is the government should do something about it rather than us. I actually think the church's responsibility is we should do something about it. Going through history, one of the things which has happened to the Australian church, and I don't want to be too blunt on this, but we've abdicated some of our responsibility. So what we've done is we outsourced a bunch of what we would have done historically to the government and said, you should do that stuff. And if you look at the biblical response to poverty, there's a whole bunch of stuff that the government sort of responds to. And that meant that as a church, we didn't have to do that stuff. Then what we've done is kind of also had these professionalised organisations, and to an extent mission is one of those. I can tell you very clearly, my preference would be mission wouldn't exist and the local churches would do our job. I would be over the moon, my board, our staff would be just overjoyed if that happened, because actually we're doing the work because the church hasn't put its hand up to do the stuff in the local communities. Going to the churches in America and into Africa, you see a very different response. A church in Atlanta, which has got a community of 1,500 houses, a whole shelter for homeless people, and it's responding itself. The crying shame in Australia, and this is confronting for us, is actually there are 1 million properties empty every night in our country. and they sit empty for various reasons. They're people's holiday homes, they're overseas investments, they're other people's investments, but a million properties a night. We don't have an issue with dealing with homelessness, we have an issue with our hearts. And all of us need to turn around and say, is there a way we can respond? And look, for you, I don't expect you to kind of respond and change homelessness totally, but turning around and saying, can I do something, is a powerful thing. And again, church down in Wollongong called Lighthouse has got 300 people in its congregation. They have 32 services to their local community. 2 of those are doing exactly what you're talking about, where they have a house looking after homeless boys and a house looking after homeless girls. And they've been running that for 17 years. And they're just saying, we can't do everything, but we can do something. Let's find a way to respond. And I think, yeah, we need to get up and do stuff like that guy in Birmingham. And just to give you a very technical, boring fact, on a given night 3 years ago in Sydney, there were more people sleeping rough in the inner city of Sydney than the whole of the United Kingdom. And that is a concern for us because it says that we can change these things if we want to. As a nation, we can make a difference. We choose to live with what goes on in our society. It's our choice. And if we don't stand up and fight for change and ask for change, we accept what goes on. And so you can change these things. There is a hope for a difference, and we need to be people who do something about it.
So can you just repeat that, the comparison between the United Kingdom and Sydney?
Yep. So in Sydney they counted there were 526 people living rough in the inner city. That was more than the whole of the United Kingdom on the same night. And the reason why in England is they created a right to housing. To say essentially as a country, we will no longer accept homelessness. Now, we lived in London for a long period of time, and I remember days in London where you would walk down streets and literally the streets were lined with teenagers in sleeping bags, adults in sleeping bags. That isn't there anymore. You can go there today and walk around London and you won't see that anymore because they've said that the situation has to change and they've created a way to get people into housing. And so it is something we can change. Many of the issues we've talked about actually are things which can change. Some of them need personal intervention. I think the most important change is us individually saying that we'll get up and help people individually. Then we can ask government to do stuff and get the big church organisations to do things too.
Oh, Kim, sorry.
I'm not sure if I missed it, but you mentioned that you're going to cover how we can support an area that's a long way away from us, that our area probably was more privileged than most. Did you come back with the examples? Did I miss them?
Maybe I missed that. Maybe I said that. I think there's an option to go and help communities which are a long way away from you. But personally, and I know you're kind of doing stuff overseas, personally, I'd turn around and say, what can we do here? How can we respond in our community? How can we actually reach out to the disadvantaged here? How can we welcome them into our church, into our community? I'll give you an example. In the New Peninsula in Melbourne, there's a church there which runs this coach program that I was talking about that we're going to roll out. But they now have a new church. And they started off with about 500 people. They have a new church of 100 people. All of those have been reached by members of their congregation, going out, meeting and working with disadvantaged people and bringing them to Christ. And that 100 people actually have their own church. Now, the reason they have their own church is that for a lot of the rest of the church, they kind of found it almost impossible to cross the chasm to deal with people from that disadvantaged background. So they said it's easier to create a new community, and that community is now itself reaching out to those who are disadvantaged. So what churches can be as a catalyst in their own community to reach out to the disadvantaged and then to help them reach out to their community. To take that to its kind of logical extension. At Mission, we work in a place called Inala in Queensland, which is one of those 14 rough postcodes, very high Indigenous community. One of our staff members there was a 17-year-old single mum. Very poor education. She left school at year 8, had a baby. And she was on our team and paid full time. And her job was to go out and to talk to other single teenage mums in her community and say there is a place that you can come where you can get help, friendship and love. And so those teenagers came and they got help, friendship and love, and they've been through a process to be taught how to be a good parent, how to be a good mum, how to read, how to play, do all the things that you need to do as a parent through that connection. And I would call you to do stuff locally. Find disadvantaged locally and work with it. And yeah, it's great doing stuff off in the city, and if you can, I always think anyone doing anything is a good thing. But try and do stuff on your doorstep. And that message of Lazarus, Jesus is saying, look at your doorstep. Look at the guy on the street outside, nearby you. He's there. Lazarus is in this community. Go find him and start to work with him. That would be my kind of recommendation.
End it there, Toby. Thank you so much for coming and sharing. Heaps there that you've challenged us with. It seems that when you said last year, at the heart of the challenge we face is the simple truth: we simply don't care enough to take sufficient action to end our homelessness crisis. It seems to me that's still the problem.
Yep.
Can I ask you one last thing? Are you seeing change for the positive?
I'm an internal optimist, and what I can categorically say is I am seeing change in individuals' lives. And at Mission, we're very blessed to see people's lives change, and that's a wonderful thing. I think from a system point of view, we've got a long way to go, and the heart of that is we assume that welfare as a model is a good thing to look after people in the long term. And actually, I think it's not. It's right when someone's got a short-term problem, and in the long term, we have to help people get towards economic participation. And if we can't help people on their journey, all we do is perpetuate them in poverty. So we're very passionate about that. I do think we're starting to see slow change. And certainly Kevin Andrews, who's the minister looking after this, is a Christian. He cares about it, and he understands that to create change we need to look at the whole system and find a better way, and I think that's happening. And I see many Christians who care about this and doing work and trying to make a difference, and we'll keep doing that. We'll personally take ownership and responsibility. If we kind of do that, us in Mission Australia, do the us in Australia, we will do our bit, we'll see change, and I also hope we'll see Christ be part of that change.
Fantastic. How about we thank Toby?